the book is that you can't actually tell genetically the difference between, say, a Cocker Spaniel and a wolf. But we know, I mean, common sense tells us, doesn't it, that there's a big difference. You may not be able to measure the differences between a Cocker Spaniel and a wolf, but you can be pretty sure that those differences are genetic and hereditary, right? Even if one is by selective breeding and the other isn't, you know. And so it doesn't stretch the imagination too far to think that, you know, perhaps there are real genetic differences between races, and those might express themselves behaviorally. For example, in, you know, different rates of crime, or, you know, different average levels of intelligence and so on. Anyway, just to make a long story short, I'll just give you a flavor of the kinds of the ton of bricks that came down on me, but I didn't know about it, okay? I mean, I'm going to read you selections from complaints that were made about me from several members of the faculty. I mean, big grown men who are professional academics, right? And one, count them, one student, female Tamil student. Here's one from a guy called Stephen Burns, a WASP, right? I am writing to, because he had been at this meeting where I waved this book around and quoted from it. He says, I'm writing to express my alarm about comments made by one of our students at the Anthony Reddy seminar on the myths of whiteness in a public forum. A plenary session of the seminar proceedings, Andrew Fraser asked a question of Anthony Reddy, beginning by noting that he was confused by Anthony's comments on race. Drew Fraser then asserted that black people do not share the same blood as white people, citing a book which he held in his hand with details of which I could not see. And then he just goes on. I mean, so, like, it was just a terrible thing to say, because one of the things that Anthony Reddy said when I made my comment was that we do share the same blood, and, you know, I could get a blood transfusion from a white person, no problem. But actually, a blood transfusion is a tissue transplant. You know, the greater the genetic difference between people who are getting transplants one from another, the more risk. You might not die, but the risk is obviously elevated. Here's, I'll just read this one. There are actually more, but this is from my theology lecturer, the one who set that textbook. I am contacting you to submit a formal complaint about one of our current BTH students, Andrew Fraser. I have had a number of verbal complaints already about this student's comments on race, ethnicity, and anti-Semitism. And yesterday I also received a formal complaint from the class tutor, Steve Wright, another WASP. His email below outlines a disturbing incident in yesterday's class where Andrew Fraser was advocating a, quote, violently anti-Semitic interpretation of the Christian faith. This is Stephen Wright's comment. And if you want to know my views on this question, which is about the preterist view of Christian theology, you just Google Andrew Fraser's Synagogue of Satan, and you can read it. As we have discussed, Drew's interactions in the theology tutorial have been of some concern to me. When making introductions during the first tutorial, Drew expressed that he wanted the study to find out why the church is so screwed up. At the time, I thought that this outburst was just a quirk of his personality. but his attitude in the tutorials has been quite hostile to the content under consideration. The most concerning interaction was during today's tutorial, in which we were considering Christology and soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. Drew kept turning the discussion to eschatology, the last days and all of that, in order to reiterate his belief that Migliori's book whitewashes the history of Israel. He is an extreme supersessionist. It seems that the supersession is achieved by the violent eradication of Israel, like AD 70, the destruction of the temple, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so make a long story short, this guy was not prepared to debate in the tutorial. Instead, these complaints are coming in April. I didn't know anything about them until June, when the head of school calls me in and tells me there's been these complaints and suggests, you know, really, why don't you just do this externally by distance? And I said, no. And so then I didn't hear anything more about it until November. In the interim, apparently, there had been an investigation by the university where they sent some guy from Dubbo to interview all of these lecturers and the students. Oh, I got to read you the student complaint. Yes, this is from a female student, mid to late 20s, who works for the Uniting Church and comes from a Tamil background. She says that I believe the views of Mr. Fraser are inherently racially prejudiced and bigoted, and his open expression of these views is causing our class to become unpleasant in nature. One of the things that she cites as an example of just my violently racist views are, in another incident, Mr. Fraser said the word racism is really just a code word for whiteness. Anyway, so these complaints, this all gets investigated. Then I hear in November that I've been made the subject of a complaint by, get this, the university ombudsman is issuing a formal complaint against me. And then I have to prepare a reply to this complaint and so on and so forth. Eventually, the lady out in Dubbo who was charged with the responsibility for adjudicating this complaint decides that I deserve a year's suspension. I appeal. Charles Sturt University, when was it? In February, I guess, 2012, pays for the chancellor of Charles Sturt University and two of his offsiders, plus the university lawyer and the university secretary, to come down to Sydney to hold a court to hear my appeal. Needless to say, and the Tamil lady was at this, and she confirmed that she definitely had been offended by me. And so once again, no dice, my appeal is rejected. And so I spent the year 2012 doing other things and then the following year I turned the other cheek and went back. But in any case, I mean, you can see that the universities are really a hotbed of anti-white feeling. Anybody who wants to stick up for the interests of white people had better be prepared to hire a good lawyer, which won't do you any good, by the way, or spend a lot of time drafting replies and so on and so forth, which again will hone your writing skills, but I really wouldn't recommend it for people who aren't retired academics. So maybe I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much, Professor Drew Fraser. Now, our third speaker in lineup today is Mr. Michael McLaren. He began his career at 2GB in 2006, working the phones for the summer mid-dawn team before being appointed the executive producer of the evening and nights program later that year. A career in radio seemed an obvious choice, as it allowed him to combine his passion for news, geopolitics, and the machinations of government with his determination to debate the big issues that affect society and hear the opinions of the everyday citizen every day of the working week. Outside of the world of radio, Michael is drawn to understanding and researching the complexities of the ancient world, among other pursuits graduating in 2010 from the University of Sydney with a BA Media and Communications, with majors and academic prizes in ancient history and classical archaeology. He's also travelled extensively throughout North Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean and Europe for both academic and personal endeavours. More than this, Michael is a long-term supporter of the Balmain Tigers and now members of the West Tigers, a member of the Golden Key International Honour Society and a member of his local golf club, among other associations. He looks forward to taking your calls or receiving your emails on whatever topic you feel needs discussion. If it affects you, Australia, or indeed the world community, or the world community, everything is up for debate. I'd like you to welcome Mr. Michael McLaren, please.
Well, nice to be here with you all this evening. Lovely to have your company, and of course thank you to Rocco and to Drew and to David for that very kind introduction. And this is the first time I think I've been here with Western Heritage Australia, so it's a great honour for me to be here this evening, and thank you for the extension of the invitation. I'll keep my chat as brief as possible so we can get to questions. I know many of you, I'm sure, certainly of those previous two presentations, would have a number of questions to ask. But the overarching topic we're here to discuss tonight or look at is political correctness compromising freedom of speech? One could say yes, but it's almost a misleading question, in that, of course, political correctness and freedom of speech aren't compatible. So, of course, political correctness will compromise freedom of speech. As I said, the two aren't compatible in many respects, but one has to question, and I think it helps when you break down what the P and what the C stand for in PC. The P, of course, is for political, which is a long version of the word politics. And we all know what politics is about. It's about the exercise of power. And the C is for, obviously, correctness. And we've all been to school. Some of us, of course, been through university. We know when we've been correct and when we've been wrong, because the reading flows quite liberally across the page depending on who your teacher was. But when it comes to determining what is correct in speech, it's not your Year 6 mathematics teacher that's going to say you completed the formula with the working out nice and you get 3 from 3, or your English academic that says you understood Macbeth better than most. It's, well, unelected representatives. Who are the people, who are the groups that determine what is correct? You can't really pinpoint them. In some respects, they're not tangible. There's some. You can say, well, of course, certain sides of politics tend to have a bit more influence than others when it comes to determining what is kosher and what is not when it comes to the spoken word, but it's a little difficult to really pinpoint exactly who is or what groups are determining what one can and can't say. And so, therefore, we go back to the overarching question again, is political correctness compromising freedom of speech? Well, there can only be one answer, and it is yes. I suppose I'll spend the rest of the time then looking at, well, why is this the case? And a couple of case studies as well. There, to me, though, does seem an element of paternalism, or to be politically correct, maybe I should throw in maternalism as well these days, that these unelected representatives, whoever they are, that are keen to wield power over the written and the spoken word, have an agenda, as it were, to put their soft little warm mitted hands over our ears and over our mouths, over our eyes, so that little gullible silly old us out there in society, no matter how well read we are, how broadly we listen, won't have our soft little precious brains darkened by nasty thoughts. And there's plenty of nasty thoughts out there. I read my email inbox every night. I can tell you some people are pretty florid when it comes to nasty thoughts. But as an example, they're always outweighed significantly by well-meaning people, intelligent people, reasoned people, nice people. And that is the way with, I think, every debate in this society. I wouldn't say in all societies, but certainly in this society. And it does, I think, point to the fact that we really should be very critical of this increasing push to limit freedom of speech, to limit expression, because we know for every Tobin out there that wants to deny the Holocaust, there are 200 others that will prove them wrong. And we all know that with a bit of intelligence we can sift through what is fact and what is fiction. Sometimes it takes a little longer. It's not always obvious in a lot of topics. But with exposure to different ideas and to different people expressing them, it's very, at the end of the day, common that society, a liberal democratic society like this, gets to the point where we get to the nub of the issue and the cranks and the wackos from all sorts of avenues of the political spectrum, like on a centrifuge, get flung off to the edge, and common sense prevails in the middle. But if you limit freedom of speech, and this is why lately on air I've been focusing so much on Section 18C and the disappointing lack of repeal, if you limit freedom of speech, you not only limit the opportunities for common sense to bubble to the surface, but in a sort of, I guess you'd say, like a mirror image, you also force the idiots underground. And like anything, the dirty laundry is always better aired than just stored away to fester. And does anyone seriously think that by not changing the so-called race hate laws, which have nothing to do with hatred at all, that the people who hold these ideas, which some would consider dangerous, some would consider unpalatable, does anyone seriously think they're going to stop thinking those ideas? Of course they're not. Does anyone think they're going to stop talking to their friends and some like-minded peoples they have in community groups and in internet forums and international? Of course they're not. They're only going to be more determined than ever to overcome a domineering patriarchal state, and their ideas will only fester and get further power. So I think in the context of me here representing, I guess, to a certain extent, somebody in the media who has to deal with the issue of political correctness every time he goes behind the microphone, looking at the lack of repeal from Section 18C recently is an important thing to have a quick look at. I've spoken to Dr. Jeremy Samet about this. I've spoken recently to Professor James Allen, the Garrick Professor of Law at James Cook University up there in Queensland. UQ, and others. And they're fairly unanimous in their belief that not only did the government squib an election promise, that's something which of course will mark them down in many people's minds, but they also displayed an element of cowardice. And it was cowardice that is not unique to them. This is something that unfortunately is growing in frequency. And it's cowardice to the fight. That's all it is. Cowardice to the fight. These so-called hate speech laws, which have not been repealed, have been repealed in Canada. I think they call it Section 13 or something like that over there. Here, Section 18C. Does anyone seriously believe that Canada, or can anyone point to any instances in Canada where race hate speech has gone out of control since a similarly so-called conservative Prime Minister and Mr Harper repealed them? No, they can't, because it hasn't happened. The United States doesn't have the same laws as we do. The problems there are no more acute than they are here. But we look at some societies around the world like Europe, be it France, Germany, you know, but they've all got these sort of freedom of speech curtailing pieces of legislation. And if anywhere in the world where there is real bubbling tension, particularly between the Islamic community and sections of the Christian community and what is left of the Jewish communities in those societies, it is a stark contrast to the relative harmony that exists on the streets here. So there's no evidence that laws